Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think we are ready to start our opening session. And our panel members are taking their seats. Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this opening plenary for our very special seminar of the National Human Rights Institutions. In a way, we are opening the European Development Days because I think we're about the first event, and I'm very pleased to see the large turnout. These are my first European Development Days, and I must say it's a remarkable setup. It is a fantastic venue for networking, information exchange, talking in the corridors and so on. So we are absolutely delighted, of course, that so many have turned up. But first and foremost, to focus on our event here at hand, I'm very, very pleased to be opening this plenary session of our very special seminar, which is, in a way, a flagship event in the context of the European Development Days, I'd say. Before we start, I should also make a practical announcement, which is indeed that in terms of interpretation, you'll find that there's simultaneous interpretation, English, French, and Spanish. English is on channel 4, French is on channel 5, and Spanish is on channel 6. On behalf of the Commission, I'd also very much like to thank the International Coordinating Committee, the ICC, of the National Human Rights Institutions, as well as the 4 regional networks for the excellent cooperation we've had in co-organising this event. This is the first ever event we do of this kind with the Commission as a co-host, organised with the National Human Rights Institutes from all over the world. We've invited all those institutions with A and B status in line with the Paris Principles, and we're very pleased that we have reached the watermark of about 100 institutions here today, which is quite an achievement. You've travelled from far, from all over the world, which is in itself a sign of your commitment to your activities. And that's one of the reasons why we think this is quite a unique event in many ways. And the reason why we're hosting it is, of course, also that we want it to demonstrate in a visible way our strong support and our commitment for all the work you're doing around the world, protecting and promoting human rights, which deserve visibility and awareness, and that's partly what we hope this event will do as well, because you're the ones who help make the application of human rights on the ground a reality. We're also very pleased to see that so many others have signed up from different areas who are actively involved in the human rights world, be it from the member states and other administrations, as well as UN bodies and institutions, agencies and academia and think tanks and aid agencies. So I think that shows the width and breadth of the stakeholders we have involved in this subject. So your presence today in this particular seminar, as well as over the next few days, will be absolutely crucial in order to ensure that we have a interactive and dynamic debate on issues of concern to all of us. The European Development Days are a remarkable opportunity, and I know that many of you will be having lots and lots of meetings in the margins to pick up on various issues. We're also, of course, meeting at a crucial moment when world leaders and development stakeholders are discussing the post-2015 Agenda for Development and the future Sustainable Development Goals. And I hope we'll have a good debate on these issues, because we all know that the national human rights institutions should have a major role in implementing the future SDGs, which will become our reference point for all the work on our future agenda. And I was very pleased to learn as well that the outcome of these discussions will feed into the work plan that the International Coordinating Committee is doing on the SDGs. So there's a practical outcome, as Your remarks and observations will also feed into a broader debate that will continue. Now, before we move on to the panelists, just a couple of points I'd like to share with you. As you know, the EU is very firmly committed to advance and to promote human rights and democracy. This is part of our foundation, of the EU's foundation, as spelled out in the treaty, which clearly reaffirms that the EU's external action is grounded in democracy, rule of law, universality, and the indivisibility of human rights. In addition to that, we also have the EU's development policy framework, which is enshrined in the Agenda for Change and based on two pillars, namely democracy, human rights, and good governance on the one hand, and inclusive and sustainable growth for human development on the other hand. The Agenda for Change is based on the idea that development and governance are not opposed, but they should be seen as complementary. And our commitment to move towards a rights-based approach encompassing all human rights for EU development is an attempt to translate those ideas into reality. At the same time, we also think that a rights-based approach is a step forward in terms of providing good quality development assistance. Within the EU, which is an equally important point, all these key principles are enshrined in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, which became legally binding in 2009 at the time of the entry into force of Lisbon. So the Charter is giving us the legal framework to uphold fundamental freedom and rights, reflecting our common values and our constitutional heritage in the EU. And part of the Charter, which applies to the EU, is that all our legislation, all our proposal have to be vetted for compliance with the Charter, and the Charter applies to all activities of the EU and their member states when they implement EU law. They have to abide by the Charter. And you may have noticed that the new Commission, when it took office last year, made a point out of repeating their strong commitment to ensuring the efficient human rights protection based on the Charter and ensuring that the Charter is fully implemented, which is, of course, the other side of it. So in the EU, we see that the European Union Court increasingly refers to the Charter in its judgments, which is a good sign and shows that we are building a coherent legal system for the protection of fundamental rights. We still have work to do, partly because a recent Eurobarometer poll showed that while 65% of European citizens have heard about the Charter, very few actually know what's in it and what it does for them. And I think that more generally also shows the importance of awareness-raising campaigns. And of course, it's also part of the role of the human rights institutions in Europe, in this case, to play a role in facilitating a better awareness and understanding of where to turn when fundamental rights are at stake. And as you know, there are 15 of the member states of the EU who are in the A status category for the national human rights institutions. Now, secondly, the EU is a very, very strong supporter of establishing and of the good functioning of independent national human rights institutions in compliance with the Paris Principles. And in fact, this event takes place at a time when the European Union is, in a very practical way, strengthening both its political and its financial support for the national institutes. This means that we have recently, the Commission and the European External Action Service adopted a proposal for an EU action plan on human rights and democracy, covering the period 2015-2019, replacing an older one, and this new proposal is now being discussed in the Council. But what's of interest to you is perhaps that it actually lists as its first priority the support to the capacity of national human rights institutions. This is a way of recognizing their role in an independent way and trying to engage with these institutions, involve them more extensively in a consultation process when it takes place at national level, and generally seeking to strengthen the capacities of institutions in order to play a more active role and in order to upgrade when necessary. So apart from this strong signal in the future action plan of the EU, we are also making practical efforts at the level of financing. And while we have over the years already financed a number of projects, be it specific or more general to provide support for the national human rights institutions, we have now, under our new financial framework, in the instrument that particularly concerns your area, namely the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, a specific mention that is aimed at supporting national human rights institutions in the financial period ahead. And to translate this into practice, we have in fact a new program of 5 million euros, which will aim to strengthen the capacity of global and regional networks of the institutions in the field of economic, social and cultural rights, as well as business and human rights more generally, and this will be launched shortly after this event. So I think these two factors taken together, that the institutions are a priority, actually the first objective in our future action plan, combined with the financial support, shows our strong backing for all the work you do. Why are we doing this now? Now, partly we have the European Development Days, but also this is the European Year of Development, which is the first time there's been such a year devoted to EU's external action and Europe's role in the world, which is in itself quite striking, and I think demonstrates the strong interest in building the EU's role and engagement in the world. And of course, the European Development Days also coincide with a raft of big negotiations at international level, a whole triad starting with Addis Ababa in July on financing, moving on to New York in September, and then on to Paris for the climate conference in December. So these events taken together form the post-2015 development agenda. And in that particular context, of course, we found that it was particularly suitable to launch a debate on the role of the national human rights institutions, that in their independent capacity, they are a key partner for the EU and have a major stake in the implementation and monitoring of the future Sustainable Development Goals. The institutions, in fact, have a unique function in building bridges between government and civil society, and it's through their monitoring, reporting, complaints handling, and advisory mandates that the institutions can maintain their role and strengthen it in upholding international human rights standards at home. This is about accountability in the end, and it is up to you to help us in reinforcing that role in the period ahead. We have many opportunities and challenges in the post-2015 agenda. Now, human rights is something we advocate all the time in the context of the SDG, and will continue to do so in a cross-cutting way. At the same time, I should also mention the importance of gender equality, which is, of course, also part of the Sustainable Development Goals, both in a particular goal and also in a more horizontal manner. And we are equally committed in this area to take the issue of gender equality and empowerment forward. So on the whole, I'd say that the EU stands for an ambitious agenda in the SDGs and in the period ahead. And we count on your support be it the national institutions, be it civil society, all stakeholders and development actors, to help us implement the SDGs in practical and tangible ways. And that's why we've chosen for the first topic of our special seminar to focus on the role of the national human rights institutions in the Sustainable Development Goals. So with those words, I think we're ready to turn to the panel. I should probably say that at one point, when the formal opening ceremony of the European Development Days starts at around 11:15, we will break up because the formal event with a number of high-ranking speakers, including President Juncker, will be screened here, so you'll all have a chance to see it. But first, I hope we will have a good and stimulating debate that we can all draw on as food for thought in the period ahead. So with those words, I think we're ready to start on our panel debate. We're very lucky to have 4 distinguished speakers to join us here today. We're now ready to start our panel debate, and we're very lucky to have here today 4 very distinguished speakers to give their perspective on the situation and also to join in a debate. I'm very happy first to introduce Mr. Mabedle Laurence Mushwana, who has joined us from South Africa. You are the chairperson of the South African Human Rights Commission and chairperson of the International Coordinating Committee for National Human Rights Institutions, as well as a former ombudsman and MP. Now, we would like to hear a little bit more from your perspective about how you see the role of the national institutes in implementing the SDG. What do you think the SDGs will do for human rights in the years to come, and how can the national human rights institutions make the best use of them? So I pass the floor to you, please. Feel free to either sit down or use the lectern.
I prefer. Thank you, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe before I begin, I need to acknowledge the European Commission Directorate General for International Cooperation and Development as funders and organizers of this major 2-day special event dedicated to NHRIs and development. Through the EU's generosity, it has been ensured that there is a large contingent of approximately 100 national human rights institutions representatives from all regions around the globe here today. For the International Coordinating Committee of National Institutions for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, its regional bodies and members, this event will no doubt be a significant, if not historical, gathering, in that it will potentially influence NHRIs practice in the area of human rights and development for years to come. This special event will also serve to cement the growing partnership between the EU and the ICC, its regional bodies and member NHRIs, as we move closer towards the implementation of a 3-year project through the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. Independent national human rights institutions, in comparison to states and NGOs, are relatively newcomers in the human rights arena. It is only in the past 2 decades that there has been a substantial increase in the number of NHRIs. This is due largely to their increasing recognition as important stakeholders that have much to contribute towards ensuring the promotion and protection of human rights. While civil society was already formally recognized as a key stakeholder alongside member states in 1948 in the UN Charter, it was only in 1993, by way of a General Assembly resolution that endorsed the Paris Principles, that NHRIs came to be recognized at an international level. Today, there are over 100 countries that have established independent national institutions, of which 71 currently enjoy formal recognition and participation right within the Human Rights Council and its related organs. This recognition is provided through a rigorous accreditation process that is run under the auspices of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights by the International Coordination Committee, which is the international umbrella body of NHRIs. Those national institutions that are fully compliant with the Paris Principles are granted formal recognition by receiving an A status. The year 1993, when the Paris Principles were recognized by the UN, was also a significant year with the hosting of the World Conference on Human Rights and the adoption of the States of the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action. The declaration marked a renewed effort to strengthen human rights globally. It also recognized the role of NHRIs in the promotion and protection of human rights and encouraged all states to establish them. National institutions play a unique and key role in the promotion and protection of human rights at a domestic level through education and awareness programs, research, and complaints handling. Another important role of national human rights institutions is to cooperate with the United Nations. It is in this way that NHRIs play an important role in advocating for recognition and implementation of international human rights standards at a domestic level, provide independent and credible information to UN bodies, and assist with follow-up to UN recommendations. It is for this reason that the United Nations recognizes national institutions as their natural partner at a domestic level, creating a bridge between the international and domestic spheres. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is trite that the Millennium Development Goals failed to directly incorporate a human rights-based approach, despite being consistent with a number of human rights standards and principles. After 15 years, the MDGs will be replaced later this year with a set of sustainable development goals that will firmly incorporate a human rights-based approach. The inextricability of human rights from development is now seen in all aspects of UN work, most recently affirmed in the Secretary General's so-called Rights Up Front initiative. Where human rights travel, so too do national institutions, and therefore it is not a question of whether, but rather how will NHRI ensure that the new Sustainable Development Goals are implemented and achieved at a domestic level. In fact, it will become a foregone conclusion that NHRIs will be actively involved at a domestic level and bring their expertise and unique responsibilities to contribute toward the successful implementation of the SDGs. One particular area in which national institutions can be involved is in the monitoring of the SDGs implementation and ensuring that the disaggregation of data ensures that the poor and vulnerable become beneficiaries, thereby transforming human rights into tangible, lived experiences. NHRIs will also play an important role in the agreed accountability mechanism in that they can provide credible and independent information at international level. In all of this, the ICC, as the representative body of NHRIs at an international level, will play an advocacy role at a high level on behalf of its members to ensure that NHRI's potential can be harnessed within the SDG processes. There will be a need for the UN to ensure that national institutions are formally recognized within the implementation, monitoring, and accountability framework of the SDGs. And there is much work that is required on this front. The ICC will also support NHRIs through education and awareness program on the SDGs and facilitate information sharing on experience, challenges, and best practices. Finally, there is much work to be done in order that we move closer to a world in which poverty and inequality is reduced, where effective governance and the rule of law is the norm, and where people live in peace and prosperity. In this endeavor, we must all join hands and work together as we dare not fail on this noble cause. I will pause here for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mushwana, for those interesting words. And we will now move on to our next speaker, Michel Forst, who's UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders. But you also have a long and distinguished past with the French National Consultative Commission on Human Rights. So I think that'll provide a good basis for your views on the national human rights institutions and how they can seek to improve better implementation of human rights in the national development processes. So please, Mr. Forst.
Thank you. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to speak French, if that's okay. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, because I can see many colleagues and friends from national institutions here in the room, and I'm very happy to be here in Brussels today for this opening session, looking at the role of national institutions in access to and promotion of development policies. Now, as the Chair said, it's as Special Rapporteur for the UN on the situation of the defenders of human rights that I'm speaking here today. And I wanted to say that implementing the right to development is, I think, one of the cornerstones of the actions carried out by human rights defenders. And of course, I see national institutions as defenders of human rights. Now, NHRIs are, for me, actors who work to ensure the respect and promotion of human rights. And I'm very happy that the European Commission has made this one of the key priorities of its human rights strategy, which it's developed. And I'm happy to hear the Chair just confirm this commitment. These institutions are not governmental, even though their role is to enlighten public decision makers, and they're not NGOs, even though they do develop policies on the basis of the pluralist nature of civil society. But so they are therefore the voice of human rights from within countries. Now, I and my predecessors have always stressed that one of the most important roles to be played by national institutions is to ensure that the principles and standards of international law and human rights are really integrated into national legislation, and that they're systematically taken into account and considered when it comes to developing public policies. And that, for me, includes, of course, state public policies as well regarding the right to development. Now, when it comes to development policies, it's essential that note be taken of the fact there are lots of different actors, state actors and non-state actors. They're all addressing these issues. I'm thinking in particular, and we'll come back to this later, of cross-border companies or multinationals, international institutions and other donors. And to understand the multidimensional aspect of this issue, I think you mustn't have this sterile opposition or a hierarchy between the issues of development, the right to development and human rights, because I think that these concepts are intertwined. How can you ensure sustainable, lasting development in countries if the people's most basic rights are not or are no longer respected? Whether you're speaking about their civil or political rights, or also their economic, social and cultural rights. So, development policies have to always remember that there are close links between all these various rights. They're intertwined, and there must be an approach based on people's rights. But unfortunately, this opposition between development and human rights is often used to discredit the work being done by defenders of human rights. It's claimed that there's an opposition between the two. Those people who are involved in defending human rights are under a lot of pressure. There are a lot of hindrances to them, and they're threatened on a daily basis. People who work to combat projects carried out by extractive industries, those who are opposed to forced expulsions within the framework of large sporting events or urbanisation and urban planning projects are hassled, attacked, imprisoned, sometimes murdered. And often, unfortunately, access to justice and to remedying measures is impossible for them because in so many countries there's a culture of impunity and there's connivance between some economic actors and the states themselves. Now, states and some non-state actors too often denigrate the action being carried out by defenders of human rights in their countries, saying that they're hostile to development in their country. Now, the obstacles faced have been mentioned at great length in some reports from NGOs, but I also heard these discussed in the 6 regional consultations I've carried out. I mentioned them then since I was appointed in Latin America, Asia, Africa, where I was last week, and I was supported in these consultations by the EU. Now, NHRIs defend human rights, and they're often threatened, therefore, by their own governments. I've had to step in on their behalf on a number of occasions over the last few weeks, and since I've had this post. Now, I'm not going to list the countries, but a number of our colleagues are currently being threatened or attacked directly by states because of the bold positions they've taken regarding the right to development and rights as a whole. Now, they have a real role to play as bodies which alert states and which advise them to make sure that states respect their rights and to make sure that third parties and private sector actors don't carry out actions which run counter to the interests of the population. Now, they also propose advice to states and also to marginalised or vulnerable groups, and they also have an essential role to play to stimulate states to make sure that they comply with international or regional standards regarding human rights. Now, and I will be saying this in my next report, which will be presented at the UNGA in October, it's important to integrate development actors in the very composition of the NHRIs to ensure that the diversity of civil society is really represented and to ensure that development issues are really taken into account in the work being done by the NHRIs. For example, they could integrate focal points on specialised development rights issues within their organisations, thereby creating a forum for exchange. This is already done. I think it's a good thing. Now, as I said, and it's important, I think NHRIs can be attacked, threatened, hassled when they're doing their work to promote and protect human rights. During the 2 regional consultations I organised a few days ago in Kampala for East Africa and Abidjan for West Africa. About 60 defenders of human rights from all over Africa came to meet me. I spoke to them. They spoke about attacks, threats, pressure they were under from their states. The members and staff of their institutions were, they said, being threatened at the moment by the states. So it's important to stress that the states have to do everything they can to make sure that these institutions can act dependently, effectively, in compliance with the Paris Principles. Now, when it comes to the UN system, a number of initiatives have been taken over the last few years, and as you know, there are also what we call the special procedures, which mean that you can more systematically link the respect of human rights to the right to development and issues related to that. A number of my colleagues, other special rapporteurs or independent experts are currently in their reports looking at these issues. You have, for example, the Special Rapporteur on the human rights and extreme poverty, the SR on the right to food, the SR on adequate housing, or the SR on the rights of native peoples. Now, when it comes to my mandate, the mandate I've been given regarding the situation of those who defend human rights, I'm focusing in particular on those people whose actions deal with development issues. Joint actions with other players are currently being carried out to remind states of their obligations when it comes to protecting NHRIs and other defenders of human rights. There are also joint actions between different mechanisms. You have the EU, and I hope we'll be speaking about this. They've developed the famous EU guidelines for the protection of defenders of human rights, and there are other actors involved in this area too. So it's important that there are joint actions with those people as well, and that these are strengthened. And then, as I said in the General Assembly, I'll be making a number of statements and comments which will stem from the 7 regional consultations I've carried out. And there too will be speaking not only about the recommendations for states, but also those for NGOs, who unfortunately, many of them, don't yet sufficiently take into account development rights issues. So concrete recommendations to states will be made, recommendations to international organisations and civil society. They'll also be drafted to improve the protection of defenders of human rights and to allow them to fully play their role in the protection and promotion of human rights. And lastly, ladies and gentlemen, I'd just say that the constant respect of human rights, of fundamental rights rather, is an excellent way in which we can divide wealth fairly through development policies. Gradually we can create a virtuous circle. So, ladies and gentlemen, if we don't base development policies on respect of the population and fundamental rights, then what you see is that too often leads to an unfair, unequal society without perspectives for the future. The progress of a state isn't measured by looking at the wealth accumulated by just a few people or by a few large international industries, but rather by the sum of the individual possibilities and collective possibilities which exist within which the people can move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Forst, for sharing your experience, your practical experience as UN Special Rapporteur for human rights defenders. It's interesting to hear how your constant dialogue, consultations, recommendations create added value, and the experience you actually have on the ground, which I hope we can debate later on. Now, let's move on to our third panelist. Mr. Vladlen Stefanov, you are head of the National Institutions and Regional Mechanism section in the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we would now like to hear your perspective about what the international community can do to help create an enabling environment for the national institutions. Please, Mr. Stefanov.
Thank you, Director Madam Knudsen, ICC Chair Advocate Mushwana, Special Rapporteur Mr. Forst, and Executive Director Mr. Saez. distinguished chairs and members of national human rights institutions from all over the world, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure and indeed an honor to address you today at the seminar of national human rights institutions during the European Development Days. At the outset, I would like to pay tribute to the European Commission and the ICC for the excellent organization of this first of its kind event targeting national human rights institutions on the occasion of the European Development Days. This seminar takes place in a crucial juncture of time when world leaders and development stakeholders are discussing the post-2015 development agenda. The SDGs framework so far has included key human rights elements, as mentioned by Advocate Mushwana, across 17 goals and 169 targets, to be complemented by the declaration, means of its implementation, as well as follow-up and review frameworks, which are being currently negotiated. The national level review process will be the most important aspect of following up on the SDGs, as this is the level at which the goals will be implemented and where accountability lies between governments and their citizens. NHRIs can play a unique role in strengthening the accountability of state and non-state actors to the people by ensuring that a human rights-based approach is effectively applied when adapting, implementing, and monitoring the SDGs at the national level. For example, national human rights institutions could facilitate the dialogue and interactions between state, private sector, civil society actors, and the people at large. The aim of this dialogue is to ensure that recommendations from international human rights mechanisms are duly reflected in the identification of national commitments to the SDGs targets. They should be also reflected in the formulation of policies and programs to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, and in monitoring progress that leaves no one behind. The national human rights institutions, therefore, can be important partners to states in clarifying their human rights obligations in relation to all aspects of SDGs implementation, monitoring, and review. They can help to ensure the systematic flow of human rights information between different national actors while increasing broader public awareness on these issues. This would result in strengthened accountability of states to the people, as well as accountability of other actors, including the private sector and businesses. National human rights institutions could critically and substantively contribute to participatory national reports on the SDG implementation, including by partnering with civil society. National institutions can provide human rights analysis of SDG implementation in their submissions to the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations and the treaty body country reviews. The central imperative of having no one behind will require monitoring progress for all, with the aim of reducing inequalities and eliminating discrimination. This, in turn, will require a disaggregation of data, wherever possible, by all prohibited grounds of discrimination, as required by the human rights law. For example, by race, ethnicity, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. In addition, since other status is not exhaustive, the grounds should also include those specified by the international human rights mechanisms, including age, nationality, marital and family status, sexual orientation and gender identity, health status, place of residence, economic and social situation. Relevant further categories of disaggregation in each country context should be defined through an inclusive and participatory process, and NHRIs can help to ensure that all relevant groups are identified and involved in that process, while at the same time ensuring that their human rights, including the right to privacy, are duly protected. National human rights institutions can advocate for strengthened legal protection of human rights and play a quasi-judicial role when they investigate individual complaints or pursue legal redress through amicus interventions and public interest litigation. Ladies and gentlemen, since the national human rights institutions have such an important role, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, through its headquarters structures, our field presences, and the United Nations country teams, provides support to national institutions around the world. In conducting many of our activities, we collaborate with regional coordinating committees of national institutions and the ICC itself. Current work by the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights with national institutions is focused on 4 major areas. First, country engagement, through which OHCHR supports efforts by governments to establish and strengthen national institutions. Second, monitoring and advice, through which the Office of the High Commissioner assesses compliance with the Paris Principles and strengthens the capacity of national institutions to work effectively and independently. Third, assisting the interaction between national institutions and the international human rights system. And fourth, strengthening partnerships, especially with United Nations agencies and programs on the ground, the ICC, regional organizations, as well as regional coordinating bodies of national institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express my deep appreciation to representatives of national institutions and to all of you who traveled from all over the world to attend this important meeting. Your commitment to human rights, and especially the work of national institutions, regional networks, and the ICC, are very much appreciated and recognized by our office. I thank you, and I wish you fruitful deliberations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stefanov, for that useful insight. There were a lot of very concrete and practical ideas on what national human rights institutions can do, and it'd be interesting to hear from you afterwards what you think of those points. Now, we've had 2 speakers on the UN side, providing the angle from that of an international organization, and we now move into a completely different sphere. Our next speaker is Ignacio Saiz, and indeed it's a different angle because you're the executive director of the Center for Economic and Social Rights, which is an international NGO in New York and Lima working to promote human rights in economic and social development policy. So given your background, it'd be interesting to hear more from you about how NGOs can contribute to support national institutes of human rights. But in addition, I also know that you, together with the Danish Institute for Human Rights, have written a paper on the SDGs and how to implement them in the area of human rights. So there are 2 interesting elements here which you can perhaps follow up on. Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much, Lotte, and thank you to the European Commission, to the ICC, and to the regional networks for organizing this important event and a very timely discussion on the role of NHRIs in the post-2015 agenda. I'm a little bit embarrassed to stand before you as the 4th man on this panel, but hopefully I can bring diversity, as Lotte said, because I do bring an NGO perspective to this discussion. CSR is an organization that has been working very actively with NHRIs on a range of issues, including this agenda. And so I wanted to share with you what we see as the reasons why the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, should matter to NHRIs, and also what role NHRIs can play in their implementation, and then to end with a couple of points on challenges and the role that NGOs might be able to play in helping NHRIs overcome those challenges. So why should the SDGs matter to NHRIs? I would say for three reasons. Firstly, their political importance. The SDGs will set the development agenda for the next 15 years. They will dictate policy priorities, funding flows at the national, the regional, and the global level. Now, even though these are just political commitments, they're not binding legal standards like human rights instruments, the truth is that the SDGs, like the MDGs before them, will have more political currency than the human rights treaties that states have ratified. It's sad that that's the case, but it's a political reality. Frankly, governments have taken their MDG commitments more seriously than their obligations under the international covenants on human rights. And that's why some of us in the human rights community, in the human rights NGO community, have been advocating for several years now that the new goals that are adopted this year need to be aligned with human rights standards. And that's important because these new development goals must serve to reinforce states' accountability to their existing human rights commitments. And this brings me to the second reason why the SDGs should matter to human rights. And that's because the SDGs, unlike the MDGs, are much more directly relevant to human rights. The relevance of the SDGs goes way beyond Goal 16. It's often said that Goal 16 is the human rights goal. I would really challenge that. Goal 16 on accountable institutions and access to justice is indeed a notable gain because the MDGs were silent on issues of civil and political rights, and their inclusion was controversial. And now we have a goal that includes targets on access to information, participation, protecting fundamental freedoms. Indeed, the existence of an independent NHRI is a proposed indicator for meeting this particular goal. But I want to stress that the SDGs are of even broader relevance to economic, social, and cultural rights. For obvious reasons, most of the goals address key economic, social, cultural rights issues such as health, education, water and sanitation, food and nutrition, decent work, social protection. Now, the difference from the MDGs is that whereas the MDGs undercut economic and social rights standards quite significantly on these issues, the SDGs and their targets are much more aligned with the provisions of economic, social, and cultural rights standards, largely due to the advocacy that many NGOs and OHCHR and others have done on these issues. To give you an example, housing. Under the MDGs, MDG Goal 7D said, improve the lives of 100 million slum dwellers. Now, this has been met, so you could say it's a success. But it's been met through measures which include forced evictions, and this goal has done nothing to stop an increase overall in absolute terms in the number of slum dwellers. There are now 200 million more slum dwellers in the world than there were before due to increase in population and urbanization. So that's an example of how not to set an indicator or a target from a human rights perspective. The SDG targets on housing are now framed much more human rights compliantly. Ensure access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing with special attention to the needs of women, people with disabilities and older persons. You can see it's a completely different framing, much more consistent with international standards on economic, social and cultural rights. And another striking feature of the relevance of the SDGs is the new commitment to tackling inequality, much more frontally. So Goal 5 on gender equality is much more comprehensive and is set to give a real renewed boost to CEDAW implementation, to the implementation of the Women's Convention. And this emphasis on leave no one behind has meant far greater attention to the disparities that are faced by people with disabilities, older persons, indigenous peoples, as well as prominent attention to income inequality. And I know this is an issue of increasing concern to NHRIs in many parts of the world since the global economic crisis, the widening of income and wealth inequality. So unlike the MDGs, the SDGs can be seen as an agenda for equality, and that's hugely relevant to NHRIs and equality bodies who have anti-discrimination and equality as their mandate. And the third reason why the SDGs matter is their universal applicability. The MDGs were seen as an agenda for developing countries alone, with industrialized countries merely playing a supporting role in international development cooperation. The SDGs are a different story. It's a universal agenda. They place commitments on all countries, including wealthier ones, to address deprivation, exclusion, and inequality in their own countries, as well as to address the responsibility that they bear, these wealthier countries, for undermining development and human rights abroad. So that means that NHRIs in wealthier countries, in all regions, can really help policymakers engage both with the domestic dimensions of the SDG commitments, what development means in Europe internally, but also the international dimensions through the lens of extraterritorial human rights obligations. So for these reasons, the SDGs should be a central concern to NHRIs from every country represented in this forum. They matter politically, they matter to human rights, and they matter universally. So what role for NHRIs? How can they engage? Well, as other speakers have said, NHRIs have a unique role to play given their mandate and their functions as independent and permanent bodies with an official mandate to ensure that all branches of government uphold their international commitments. We and many others in civil society see NHRIs as a critical piece in the accountability architecture of the SDGs. NHRIs have often been described, and indeed have been on this panel, as playing a bridging role between the national and the international, between government and civil society, across government institutions and areas of policy. And that bridging role is particularly valuable in this context, because you need institutions working at those interfaces to play a leading role in overseeing implementation and monitoring of the new commitments. And I think all NHRI functions, whether it's the monitoring, the reporting, the advisory role, the complaints handling, all of these can make a distinct and valuable contribution to the implementation of the SDGs. In the briefing that Lotte mentioned that we have produced with the Danish Institute for Human Rights, we propose a number of concrete ways in which NHRIs can engage in implementation. I don't really have time to canvass them all. I'll just flag them and would alert you to the briefing, which I think was circulated to all participants at this forum. Firstly, I would say that NHRIs have a key role to play in the national tailoring of goals, targets, and indicators. This is a process that is beginning to happen already. While the agenda is a universal one, certain targets, indicators, and benchmarks will need to be set at the national level, reflecting different national contexts and realities. Now, NHRIs have a huge role to play in ensuring that this tailoring process doesn't serve to undercut human rights standards, but takes the substantive provisions of human rights norms into account in that national tailoring. A second role is around advising governments on their national plans and policies intended to give effect to the SDGs. Now, this could be on national development plans as a whole. The Palestinian Independent Commission, for example, is looking at how its development plan writ large relates to human rights. Or it could be on particular areas of expertise that NHRIs have in a given context, whether it's gender discrimination, monitoring incarceration rates, where here, in such cases, NHRIs might undertake, for example, or might propose human rights impact assessments of certain policies that are being proposed. So these are examples of how they can advise governments on the policies intended to implement the SDGs. Many of you will have heard in the discussions around the SDGs the notion of policy coherence. This is a big buzzword around ensuring that all areas of public policy serve to promote development. Well, this surely is a critical role for NHRIs, because NHRIs have that broad mandate. They can and should supervise the coherence of all areas of public policy with human rights commitments. And that includes the policy coherence between domestic policy and global policy. Here I want to draw your attention to some very interesting work the German Institute for Human Rights has done with regard to policy coherence domestically and internationally. A recent paper which the German Institute has done on extraterritorial obligations and how an NHRI can play a role in monitoring and following up complaints that a country's national development cooperation policies have infringed human rights abroad. So it's a good example of looking at that policy coherence between the domestic and the international. I also wanted to add that in terms of advising on policies, NHRIs can play a crucial role not just in the content of those policies, but how they are financed. Questions of budgeting are questions of human rights. And there's a lot that has been done to monitor budgets, both the tax side and the budget side, from a human rights perspective. And this is a critical role that NHRIs could play. Thirdly, and I'll be very brief here, a third task is around monitoring progress on the SDG commitments from a human rights perspective. My previous speakers have talked a lot about this, but I think there's a particular role that NHRIs can play in being attentive to tracking patterns of inequality. My fear is that, or a widespread fear, is that even though the SDGs contain good commitments on inequality, that in the monitoring, that's where that attention to disaggregation, that attention to discrimination will fall through the cracks. And I think NHRIs have such experience in monitoring standards like CEDAW, the CRPD. These instruments, in a sense, should be the normative framework guiding how leave no one behind is operationalized, how that principle is operationalized. To move on, the fourth role that I think NHRIs can play is in fostering accountability of state institutions and securing redress for victims of abuse. Now, in the current discussions going on right now in New York, there is a real aversion to the term accountability. You'll see people treading on eggshells with the language of accountability. And it's become controversial, and even the word monitoring to some has become unpalatable. That's why the language has been diluted to follow up and review. So accountability has become follow up and review. That's for reasons, for logical reasons that have to do with north-south dynamics at the UN. Many developing states or G77 states are concerned that accountability is code word for finger-wagging by rich countries and aid conditionality. But we're trying to navigate that dynamic and reinsert the language of accountability because, after all, this agenda is about boosting accountability, and NHRIs are all about accountability. So my point is that NHRIs can contribute even on the hard-edged dimension of accountability. What do I mean by this? Well, many NHRIs have quasi-judicial mandates to receive complaints, to conduct investigations and audits into human rights violations. So they have a unique and valuable role to play in channeling grievances brought by people who claim their rights have been deprived in the development context, in relation to a policy being implemented under the SDGs. And NHRIs can ensure those deprived of their rights in the development context obtain remedies and that institutional failures are rectified. Of all the accountability mechanisms that are under discussion, very few are addressing this harder-edged dimension of accountability. And that's why I think NHRIs have an indispensable role to play. As has been previously mentioned, NHRIs have a critical role to play in ensuring accountability of all actors, not just state actors, including those beyond the state. The post-2015 and financing for development negotiations have assumed that there will be an increasing role for the private sector in financing and delivering on sustainable development. And there has been very little effort taken to include safeguards in the SDGs against the negative effects that corporate activity can have on human rights and development, from natural resource extraction to mass tax evasion. Now, the increased attention that NHRIs are going to be giving in the coming years to the human rights impacts of the private sector, and NHRI's ability to receive complaints concerning business-related abuse, applying the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, these will be particularly important in rectifying this serious accountability deficit in the SDGs. And finally, the last area where I think NHRIs can really play a role is around civil society participation. It is crucial that civil society remains actively engaged in monitoring these commitments, in their implementation, in helping to formulate and design policies to give effect to these development commitments. But there is a real fear, we are very concerned, that we as civil society will be cut out of the process. This was a very consultative process up to now, when it was a question of designing the goals. You know, the participation levels have been unprecedented, and I would be the first to acknowledge. But there is a fear that many member states are saying to us, okay, your moment has passed. We now leave this to the big boys. Now leave this to the member states. And so there is a serious concern that the impetus to engage, to involve, to engage civil society will be lost. When you also take into account what Michel Faust was describing, the serious patterns of repression that many of those activists and defenders who are focused on economic and social rights or on issues of development, that they face, then you can see why this is a very, very real concern. NHRIs, because of their bridging role, because of their convening power, they have a key role to play in ensuring that this closure of civil society space is challenged and doesn't happen. So to conclude, what can be done to enable NHRIs to engage more effectively, and what can we, from an NGO perspective, contribute? So it's clear that NHRIs have a very valuable role to play, and we've seen that there are many entry points. But we have seen in the many years of work with NHRIs that many institutions face challenges, serious challenges, which need to be overcome if this potential role that I'm describing is to be fulfilled. Those challenges are very varied. They include constraints on their mandates in some cases, constraints on their independence in other cases, and probably in all cases, constraints on capacity and resources. So I want to focus here on that latter because my organization, the Center for Economic and Social Rights, has been working for the last 5 years or so to help NHRIs monitor economic, social, and cultural rights more effectively. And so we've seen firsthand the challenges that they face and that many of us in the human rights movement face in this sphere. Because the fact is that economic and social rights require different tools of research, different tools of analysis and evidence gathering than civil and political rights. For example, you need to engage more with quantitative methods, with the use of indicators. You need to engage more with social and economic policy analysis, tax and budget analysis, in order to assess whether states are generating and using their resources in human rights compliant ways. We've been helping NHRIs in different contexts to skill up on their approaches to ESCR monitoring. We've been in a very fruitful partnership with the Asia-Pacific Forum of National Human Rights Institutions and have been working with NHRIs in the region there to apply innovative monitoring methods to assess socioeconomic policies and development policies from a human rights perspective. As a result, we're producing a training manual, Defending Dignity, on monitoring of ESC rights by national human rights institutions, and are also producing other resources with this aim. So we've seen, in conclusion, that there is a huge appetite for getting up to speed, for upping the game on economic and social rights monitoring by NHRIs, and there is increased interest by NHRIs in transforming this new development agenda into one that promotes accountability to people's human rights. After all, as the Declaration on the Right to Development says, the human being is the central subject of development. So this is a key opportunity for NHRIs to play a leading role in that transformation. I'm very pleased to see that the ICC and that the regional networks are engaging with the European Commission's support in this process, and CSR, as many other civil society organizations, I'm sure, stand ready to assist however we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ignacio, for that very rich contribution. We've now had input from, call it the ICC side, from UN representatives, and from NGOs. So it's now time to turn to the floor. And I do indeed hope that we will see a better rebalancing on the question of gender, and that many of you will intervene to recreate a better diversity. But just a couple of points on what's been said so far. There seems to be a wide view that the SDGs are indeed more important than ever, more important than their predecessor, the MDGs, and that therefore the role of the human rights institutions will be absolutely critical and essential for the future, because the SDGs will follow us for the next decade, the next 15 years. There seem to be sort of two areas where the institutions could play a role, or rather two phases perhaps. One is an early phase, early intervention in terms of figuring out or helping to advise about how the SDGs should be translated into national policy, and offering advice to see how that's done, combining that indeed with human rights impact assessment, policy coherence advice, and the budget aspect, as was mentioned. And the other side is then the follow-up in terms of monitoring, accountability, advice on redress. But anyway, the floor is open. I would just ask you to kindly introduce yourselves and whom you represent or where you are from. But, right, I'll take the gentleman in front of me first, and I think we'll try to regroup several questions, and either you can address the panel directly, but you're of course free to make observations and remarks in general.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My name is Jan van der Veenis. I'm the Legal Desk Director of Waterlex. I'm actually representing Victoria Mohez, who is the Secretariat Leader of the NHRI Water Network. So she is a woman, but I'm here as a man. But speaking on behalf of women, obviously, as well. I think it's we've been very successful with Waterlex, creating a water network, an NHRI water network, delivering trainings. Last year, 12 NHRIs were trained on water, and water is an obvious, thorough and strong link in the SDGs. With the help of the Danish Institute, the Hungarian Institute, and the South African Commission, with Karam Singh from the South African Institute. And I think we fully agree on the why and the what. I think the next step is also something that we should look at the how. So how do we empower NHRIs to enable them to take on SDGs, to enable them to take on, in my case, water issues which are related to food, energy, business, development, poverty relief. And a very good practical thing that we've developed is a best practices manual, and it's downloadable online at waterlex.org, but I have a few with me. And I think, and this is a question, linking to a question, and I have two small questions. My first question would be, so sharing the best practices, Mr. Mushwana also said, so it's very important. I think in this time and age, we should make this sharing of best practices digitally possible, so that we create online networks that are easy accessible. We are working at a platform, but I think it's highly relevant for SDGs as well. And I would like to hear your opinion on that of the distinguished panel. And my second question is also, we've been training national institutions, and immediately we saw, and we got requests from those institutions, come back and train our regional institutions. Because when we are talking to stakeholders, when we are talking to people on the ground, environmental, water, human rights defenders, it's the people that have very distinct cultural issues as well, in fact, around water, around food. So you cannot just train a national institution and be gone. There's a very high link to the lowest level of participation in a country. So I would also see how the distinguished speakers see that as a channel, as a challenge, and how they would advise to take that on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's regroup some comments. Lady in front of me, please.
Bonjour, je suis Irabia Abdelwadoud.
I'm from Rabia Boudin. I am the chair of the Commission on Human Rights in Mauritania, and I'm very pleased to be here today. We are hearing a language which we haven't heard in most of our countries, and that is the willingness of the European Commission and the Europeans to strengthen the dialogue with the NHRIs. I've been in the Commission for some time, and what we've seen in most of the African countries, and my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, but at least in Mauritania, the EU delegation completely refuses to work with us, and I'll explain to you why. The NGOs make devils of us. We don't do the NGO work. We don't denounce strongly enough, and we don't have head-on collisions with the government. Or there is a complete lack of understanding of the role of NHRIs. The Commission has excluded us from its dialogue with other organizations in Mauritania, so there is this lack of understanding, and I'm very pleased that we might have a new working partnership in the future. The other thing I think is that we hope to take advantage of this possibility of dialogue with you over the next 2 days, and we would ask you and the Commission to call on the EU delegation in Mauritania to understand us. Our role is to advise the government, to draw attention to violations. We work with the High Commissioner every day, and I am very pleased with their contribution. And those who defend human rights, I'd like to thank Michel, who is my friend and president. We have a great deal of hope in this new partnership with the EU. Thank you.
There was a gentleman right in front. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Morning. This is Muhammad Yassin, University of Udine. These valuable interventions for the SDGs, I don't believe that the world will take the same path which it has taken from 2000 up to 2015. The path and the velocity of development and dynamics will be more accelerated, so we will not expect to be binding to have I don't think that these SDGs are taking into consideration the dynamics and the change which will take place. And the most important events which will take place in Addis Ababa and in Paris and New York this year will determine how these SDGs will be framed. But it seems that already the agenda is already set, and most of the world will be only following. Going back to the role of the national institutions, the respect of human rights, and in your intervention you have mentioned that we have to engage the national institutions with the civil society organizations. However, these nations, especially in conflict-prone nations where there is no democracy, that governments are appointing their civil society organizations, and non-governmental organizations are almost arms of that governments and dictatorship, and they are just trying to assist these governments in their policies. So what will be the remedies in this case? I don't think that the partnership with the national institutions will be effective and efficient in the respect of human rights and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. I had a gentleman at the back. Please hold up your hands so staff can identify you. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Henry. I come from Asia. I represent the Asian network of NGOs working with national human rights institutions across Asia, very closely associated with APF. This has been a wonderful panel. On the one hand, we've had the ICC, the UN Special Rapporteur, as well as the Office of the High Commission speaking about the possibilities of action for intervention And we've had civil society representative very excellently highlighting the major tasks that are before them. And for me, my concern is, are national human rights institutions independent enough to undertake this major task of monitoring governments on the issues of development policies? This is a great challenge. This is a challenge for national human rights institutions, as well as for human rights defenders across Asia in particular. But without the standards of these institutions being enhanced, which means your accreditation standards being enhanced to real standards where we get independent institutions, we will not have the independent institutions which are necessary to undertake this very onerous task. I come from India, where people speaking about development today are under restriction. Ford Foundation is blacklisted. Greenpeace has a number of cases in courts. Many of us are under attack. The national human rights institutions are carefully avoiding these issues. So the independent nature of the institution has to really be enhanced, which means the ICC SCA standards will definitely have to go higher than what it is today. Could we have a response from the ICC chair, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's take one more question before we get back to the panel. The lady to my left, please hold up a hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the organization, the EU who organized the program, and of course appreciate the speakers with concern that they were all men. I'm Sima Samar from the chairperson of Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, coming from a conflict and post-conflict, and I don't know which kind of a country. But the Human Rights Commission in Afghanistan, we did a monitoring of economic, social, and cultural rights from 2004 onward. We are publishing our reports every year with specific recommendation to the donors and also to the government, to the parliament, to most of the people. But the problem is that we do not have that capacity within the government to actually take those those recommendations really seriously. And one of the reasons is the donors have their own plan on development and social and cultural rights improvement in Afghanistan rather than one united approach. So my question is that how could we make the donors to act according to the MDG has gone to SDG? And the second question is that what mechanism that really keep them accountable in order to really pay what they promised and what they would do in their own respective countries. Like most of the, let's say, powerful countries or developed countries do not have national institution of human rights themselves. So what could be done in order to promote them and convince them to establish an independent national institution of human rights? Thank you.
Thank you. Should we perhaps give the panel a chance to respond very quickly? I think there are a couple of questions for Mr. Mushwana, and afterwards for Ignacio. But perhaps you wish to reply to the questions about standards for institutions. And there was also a point about information exchange via websites and better training. I think the mic works.
Thank you. I think there are two important questions raised, firstly by the gentleman from the university, which is more or less the same question as asked by the gentleman from India. The question of countries where there is no democracy. And with regards to Asia, the question where NHRIs are being intimidated. I think these are concrete and real issues. We have experienced it so far. Maybe to start is what other mechanism, what experiences can we share, even if we live in a non-democratic countries? What is it that we can share together and still implement? For instance, here we are meeting on the ways and means of how to implement, monitor SDGs. How about asking, for instance, the Human Rights Council to ensure that during the UPR, which I believe all countries are keen to appear before the UPR, how about suggesting that within the UPR, one of the clauses that they need to ask each country that appears before it is related to the SDGs? Because you may have difficulties at homes, but you can be able to network with the other countries that appear before the Human Rights Council. They can ask those questions for you. We have had situations where, for instance, in one country, where the entire Human Rights Commission was charged for having raised questions within the Human Rights Council. This is a real challenge. It's not theoretical. We do have countries where you cannot do anything. But in countries where you do exist, nevertheless, we need to find a way of dealing with the government. For instance, in our collaboration with NGOs, NGOs can say things that I cannot say as a national human rights institution. So it is important to forge relationships with NGO, universities. They can say things that I cannot say. So we need to be proactive, looking at what our Act allows us to do, what can we do with civil societies, academicians, and related organizations. There are no easy answers, but I'm prepared to discuss further outside this because we don't have enough time. I thought I'll just deal with that, but there are many. We'll see if we still have time.
Thank you. Perhaps, Mr. Sage, you wish to say a word about civil society, NGOs, and how you argued that they were very involved, very much part of the consultation process. But I think there were some who expressed a view that NGOs were not always involved.
Is this working? Yeah. I don't recall hearing a question saying that the NGOs weren't always involved, but that there, in certain conditions, the capacity for involvement is very limited, and in certain conditions, I think somebody said that the so-called NGOs are actually government appointed, so they don't have independence. I mean, I think up to now, as I said before, you have to distinguish between the different levels of participation in this process. This is a process that much of which has been led at the UN in New York, but a lot of it is going on at the regional level. Regional UN commissions, for example, are becoming increasingly important forums for decision-making on the post-2015 agenda. But the primary site of interest is the national level. And so levels of participation by NGOs have varied according to which sphere you're talking about. At the international level, it has been unprecedented. But like I said, in many countries, there's a tendency to close down civil society space, and my fear is that this window of opportunity that the post-2015 agenda opened will be shut quite fast. I wanted to respond to a couple of things that came up. Sharing best practices digitally, I think that's an important idea, and perhaps far be it from me to suggest this, but perhaps it's something that the ICC working group on post-2015 could consider as a task. Mapping where there is good practice and what can be learned from it. When we were putting together the briefing with the Danish Institute for Human Rights, we tried to highlight some good practices, and they're mentioned in the briefing. But I'm sure there are many more that are simply not documented or not widely shared within the NHRI community. So that would be a very important task. I think in the manual that we've been putting together with the Asia Pacific Forum on NHRIs, we've also tried to cite good practices from within the Asia Pacific region, specifically on monitoring economic and social rights or monitoring development policies. On the issue of, are NHRIs independent enough? I think this was Henry's question. Just one thing that's of interest, as I think I mentioned, was that under Goal 16 on accountable institutions and governance, one of the proposed indicators, and the discussion around indicators is still ongoing, but one of the proposed indicators is the existence of an A-grade NHRI, which is quite remarkable. That's, the NHRIs are now firmly, explicitly in there in the SDGs in that context. And so, if that gets adopted as an indicator, then the SDGs themselves, Goal 16, will be a spur to NHRIs upping their standards. It will be an incentive, an added incentive, an international incentive for NHRIs to meet the requirements of the Paris Principles. So that's something of note, I think. And to Seema's question about how to make donors accountable, I mean, this is really the elephant in the room around the post-2015 agenda. I think the SDGs are different in contrast to the MDGs. The accountability relationship in the MDGs, let's be frank, was primarily one of donors, of developing countries' accountability to their donors. Not so much developing governments accountable to their citizens, or all governments accountable to their citizens, but it was a one-way relationship to donors. And I think we've moved away from that paradigm. But the power dynamic is still there. And the reality that you described in Afghanistan is, I'm sure, the reality in many countries that NHRIs may do a fantastic job in making recommendations, but the executive or the government can't act on them because they're constrained because of other policy priorities that are being pushed on them either internally or externally. I think this is why we and some others in the human rights community, have been very interested in the notion of extraterritorial obligations, because that's a human rights response to this question. What normative standards do we have to hold donors to account? Extraterritorial human rights obligations. How do they apply in the SDG context? We've published on this, and some others are doing excellent work as well. And I think that might hold the key to a human rights response to the phenomenon that you're raising. Apologies.
Thank you. I think we need another round of questions, as there are lots of observations out there. Let me just say that when it comes to our future action plan on human rights, this will be an action plan where it's for member states, the EU institutions to do the implementations. And our delegations are also part of that process of implementation. So there will be further up at the level of delegations in terms of looking after the first priority of capacity building for the national human rights institutions. Also, just on civil society and NGOs, we do a great deal and probably had more funding for that thematic subject than anything else to support, again, the capacity building, the networking of civil society and NGOs, as well as local authorities. So let's hope that also gradually yields results. Right, further questions? Okay, the gentleman at the back, please hold up your hand. Yes, you. Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Tobias Schmitz from Waterlex International Secretariat in Geneva. I have a question, actually, to all panelists, based on a sense of urgency. I'll start with the words of UN Special Rapporteur on the Human Right to Water and Sanitation, Katrina Albuquerque, who is now no longer a special rapporteur, but she has worked on the topic for 6 years. She has commented largely on the subject of access to water and sanitation, saying that during the Millennium Development Goals, it was possible to go through the whole period and realize the Millennium Development Goals in the sense that the aggregate statistics pointed to the realization of the goal. At the same time, the lowest 20%, the poorest 20% of the population globally was not incorporated in the planning exercise. So the specific targeting of the poorest and marginalized and the monitoring of whether or not that they are being included in the planning process is an essential part of the SDGs. Now, I think that one of the very positive outcomes of the MDGs is that they have built a huge monitoring capacity. So during the last 15 years, monitoring has really grown in its capacity. However, I noticed that during the Global Expanded Monitoring Initiative, which is expanding UNICEF and WHO's monitoring capacity to include also water resources planning, wastewater management, and so on, again, the national human rights institutions are not being involved. And with the Sustainable Development Goals having 169 separate monitoring indicators, I'm scared that the capacity at national level to monitor is going to be very weak unless NHRIs are involved in the process. So just to share a sense of urgency that I do not see NHRIs being mainstreamed in the monitoring institutions for monitoring the SDGs, and I would really advocate, certainly for the sphere of water, that they be part of this global expanded monitoring initiative, and I'd like to share and discuss with you on ways in which that could be done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. The lady right in front of me, please. The microphone is coming.
Thank you very much for this important session. Dr. Salam Al-Khafaji from Iraq High Commission for Human Rights, a board member. I'd like to mention something in the case where development needs a stability in the country, and when there is no there is a conflict or no political stability, it will affect any method for development. So how could we deal with that? Can the NHR can share in making conflict resolution between these political entities? This is firstly. Secondly, we are speaking about development after 2015. In Iraq, we need development after ISIL liberation from some areas. So how could we work when we have occupation of some foreigners as ISIL in Iraq in areas and other are liberated? And we have now some areas have been liberated, and we need to have them to have development to be with the same line with the other governments. How could we work on that? Thank you very much.
Thank you for those questions. The lady to my left, could you please stand up?
Merci. C'est
Thank you. I'm Mrs. Kabilwa from the Interregional Forum for Congolese Women in Belgium. I have a question to the people who spoke about human rights. Two questions, actually. Firstly, the first thing I think is important, we've spoken a lot about, or we do speak a lot about human rights and violations committed against people who are defending human rights in certain countries. We have different bodies at a high level. We have the UN, we have large conferences like this, we have organizations which pass laws, there's The Hague. So there are lots of bodies which are present, which can also take real decisions. But in the meantime, we're seeing that there are countries where negative actions taken against the defenders of human rights. And now there are people there who are there to defend the population, to ensure that they can avail themselves of their rights, to ensure justice in countries where there's injustice. Now, if these people are threatened, then that means it's going to be difficult to make any progress in that area. And in the countries in question, the people who carry out these violations of the law continue to do so, and everyone can see that. So I think that it's important that large bodies can create decisions or provide the means to make sure that those people who are violating human rights, or people in countries where there's no where there may be no democracy, it's important that measures are taken to ensure that there can be real democracy in these countries, and to ensure that people defending human rights can act freely, because that will enable us to ensure development and to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But until these actions are taken, until real action is taken, we're going to be we're not going to be able to make progress. Now, the problem of migration, that is interlinked. Migration, we've seen it's very dramatic. We've seen that recently. it started as just a small-scale thing, but it's become much larger because the injustice is continuing. There's a flood of people. What are they fleeing? Well, economic problems, yes. But there's not progress being made in some countries. We haven't achieved the Millennium Development Goals. But there's also political pressure, injustice. There are people fleeing dictatorships. There are people who are not protected in their countries. Now, when these people experience these kind of things, they have to try to find a solution elsewhere. Now, there are lots of bodies which could decide or find the means to take actions to help these people in those countries. We need something more than what we have now, because what we've seen is that what we have at the moment isn't providing the solutions which we need. And that's one of the reasons why we're not achieving the Millennium Development Goals. We've said a lot about these aspects, but now we need to try to find real solutions so that there can be less of a negative impact on people, so that there can be development, and so that we can combat the inequality which is leading to the and problems which are leading to the floods of migrants as well. So I think there are lots of things which need to be looked at.
Over there, blue shirt.
Merci. Je suis Monsieur Jikonge et
I'm Mr. Jikonge. I represent the regional office for migration issues in Brandenburg in Germany. I'm very pleased that some very good decisions have been taken, and we have now realized 15 years down the road that the MDGs were not really appropriate for the situation. What is being done to make the new objectives credible? Let me give you an example. Large companies aren't able to adopt these objectives by moving their structures to developing countries and using child labor. What can we do for the arms industry to adopt these objectives, knowing, as we do, everything that's going on? I won't repeat what the lady said, but could you please tell us to what extent you yourselves are adopting these objectives politically? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take a couple of more questions before giving members of the panel a chance to reply. Please, the lady on my right.
Bonjour. Je suis.
Good morning. I'm the president of the National Commission for Human Rights in Mali. Firstly, I'd like to thank the EU for organising this forum and also for allowing us to be here today. And I'd like to thank all our partners. Now, I have a concern. One of the speakers said that NHRIs are recognised as key actors on the international stage. But on the national stage, at national level, there is a problem. There's a problem when it comes to our authorities because they still don't understand what role the NHRIs can play. If you look at my country, that the role which NHRIs can play isn't properly understood. So, my question is, what can the EU do to make sure that authorities recognise the importance of the role which NHRIs can play in terms of promoting and protecting human rights, and also in terms of implementing the Sustainable Development Goals? That's my question, because the president of the CIC is here. There are national human rights commissions which do not yet comply with the Paris principles, and it's all well and good saying that we want to improve that, but there is a problem. So we need the EU and all other partners to ask the authorities to bolster the status of NHRIs so that they can play their role. Thank you.
Gentleman right in front. Yes.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much. I'm from the University of Lorraine. To reply to the two ladies' concerns, and to reply to what my university colleague said a moment ago, I think there is a lack of penalties. You need the carrot and the stick for things to work. We have written an awful lot about human rights. There are many institutions which we've mentioned here. But the one thing that's missing nationally if we're talking about the UN has to respect the national authorities. So the national authorities don't have a stick, don't see a stick on their threatening them. So they don't respect human rights, and that will continue to be that way. You are in the Commission. We know that cooperation development has the principle of conditionality attached to it, which doesn't always work. Internationally, is it possible for us to have a special court to ensure the respect for human rights as we have here in Europe, the Court of Human Rights or the European Court of Justice? Could we have a court which is not a national court, which would see to it that the national authorities in a democratic country or not be obliged by the UN bodies to respect the rights so that we can ensure that these are the rights of everyone?
One more question, and then I have to turn to the panel. Right, okay, the gentleman there, yes.
Thank you so much. I am Hafid Abbas, Commissioner from the National Commission of Human Rights of the Republic of Indonesia. Thank you so much to EU to organize this very important and historic event. And also to all panelists, your perspective was very insightful. Indonesia is indeed a new democratic country. We just moved from authoritarian regime to democracy last 17 years. We changed our approach to development from centralistic system to the centralized system. So Indonesia with about 18,000 islands, 254 million people is almost equal to EU. And it's not easy to manage it. But we have democratized our system. But there was a dark side of democracy. In my capacity as a commissioner at the National Commission of Human Rights of this country, every single day I receive at least 30 complaints across Indonesia. And the major complaints is only two actors. One is local authority, second is police, and the third is businessman. So those three actors are the violators for human rights. So how to manage local authority? They're real implementers for the agenda of SDGs. How to fight with the police? They're very powerful. And how then we change the conspiracy for the local authority with business community. So probably all panelists, I would like to learn more from your perspective that how can Indonesia could manage this dark side of democracy. That's my perception, that in order that we arrive at a strong tradition of democracy and we can properly implement the SDGs agenda. I thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for that question. I will just let Mr. Forest give a reply to some of the questions, followed by one more panel member. Please.
Merci bien.
Thank you, Lotte. Just coming back to 2 points. I said that I'd just been involved in a series of regional consultations which started in October 2014 to get the viewpoints of civil society organisations and human rights defenders. Now, after those consultations, or at the end of them rather, I've met more than 500 defenders of human rights from more than 110 countries, the aim being in particular to focus on those working on development rights. And I've met farmers' organizations working against deforestation, those who combat the extractive industries who come in and boot people off the land, those who work on the right to housing and who are fighting against the fact that in order to get housing built, native peoples are often thrown off the land. I've also met those who are working on the right to drinking water. So these organizations gave me a message too for the Commission, and one of the questions they wanted me to ask was to check whether the Commission, well, I wanted to check rather whether they were aware of the Commission's guidelines on human rights and whether they'd been invited by the EU delegations to participate in the annual meetings organised by the delegation with human rights defenders on the guidelines. So I wanted to know whether the people there were aware of these guidelines. Now, most of these organisations had never been invited to meet the EU delegations. The delegations tend to invite those who work on civil and political rights, but these new categories of defenders of rights are not listened to, they're not targeted, if you like, they're not contacted by the delegations to come to these meetings. So one thing which stems from these consultations, which I'll put in my report to the Commission, is that in the EU delegation guidelines, they should focus on meeting these new categories of rights defenders who are working on the right to development and access to rights, to different rights, various rights. Secondly, to do with the NHRIs compliance with the Paris principles. Now, Henry and others said that NGOs can't always trust the institutions. It's true, if you look at the UN accreditation system for NHRIs, there's one key thing which is lacking. It's good it's been said here. The Commission is really focusing on NHRIs as a priority. They want to help institutions to be stronger and more independent of the state. So I think in the accreditation system, the voice of civil society needs to be systematically heard, and the voice of those defending rights needs to be heard and sought every 4 years when the assessment is carried out to see whether there's compliance, whether the NHRIs are complying with the Paris principles. So this is something which could be looked at. The aim is to make sure that those people who never speak out, if you like, have a chance to say whether that they think the actions of the NHRIs in their countries are actually effective.
Please, if you'd like to intervene before we wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, Lotte. First of all, I felt some concern in the room about the issue of independence of NHRIs. Michel already touched upon this issue. How can we expect the NHRIs to live up to their to the expectations for the follow-up to the SDGs if they're not independent enough? It's a very valid question. I would like to just very briefly mention the fact that there is a basic international standard as to the independence of the NHRIs, which is called, of course, the Paris Principles, and there is a regular process of review of the compliance of every NHRI which has been accredited with the Paris Principles, and this accreditation and re-accreditation procedure is carried out by the ICC with support from the Office of the High Commissioner. This procedure has become more rigorous, but also fairer and more transparent in the last years. The subcommittee on accreditation comes with a long list of recommendations each time it accredits and re-accredits NHRIs, even when they keep the status of A status, the highest level, they get a lot of recommendations. So there is this monitoring and evaluation process. Another interesting question that was asked by the women's NGO on my left about the impunity, how to avoid impunity and what is the role of NHRIs. I will just mention the quasi-judicial functions of the NHRIs. In addition to their function to train and to raise awareness of the judiciary, NHRIs, many NHRIs have also the individual complaints handling function, and that creates a lot of tools for the NHRI to combat impunity. how to work with local authorities. The last question that we got from the Indonesia Commission, I think here the NHRIs also have a unique role to play because NHRIs have their local offices, which ensure access by the most vulnerable and the poorest in the provinces, and they should work with the local authorities, these local offices of the NHRIs. This is also very important to bear in mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those last comments. I'm now being told we do finally have to stop. There are a lot of partly unanswered questions that we will try to follow up on in the next coming days, be it on local authority, civil society, what the EU can do, which is quite a lot on the ground, working with national governments. But I think we have a lot of time ahead of us in the afternoon session and tomorrow, lots of networking possibilities. So we'll follow up on those questions which have not been answered and look forward to hearing many more remarks. But first of all, thank you for playing such an active role. I realize we could have continued for a couple of more hours listening to all the valuable comments you have to make on the role of the national human rights institutes. We'll get a chance to discuss, and we've taken good note of the comments made, but now I think we have to break for the screening of the formal opening. Thank you very much for your participation, and we look forward to further discussions. There will be a drink tonight, just be aware, which might also interest you, a sort of buffet cocktail at about 7 o'clock. And we've had confirmation that Vice President Mrs. Mogherini will be joining us briefly for that moment, again as an acknowledgement by the External Action Service as well of the importance that the institutions play in the future and in the implementation of the SDGs. Thank you.